Good morning, everyone. I wanted to leave you a video note that gives us an opportunity to think about what we learned and what we talked about in this opening session of History 201. And that will also help to get you thinking and linking to the things that we're going to be doing over the whole course of this semester together. So first, let's review the three building blocks of history that we introduced here with Chapter 1. So those are primary sources, secondary sources, and historiography. So how are each used and how are they related to one another? Well, many of you already put some of this together in your post, which is awesome. That's exactly what I wanted to see happening, and I'm so excited to see you already kind of turning those gears and thinking about how we know about the past, how we learn about the past, and then how we talk about the past. Okay, so those are kind of the three areas. So primary sources, again, are the stuff of history. If you think about how do we know about the past, that question that I posed, well, how do we know about the past? People's experiences. If they were literate and they wrote something down, then we could read that, right? But especially in the time period that we're talking about in our course this semester, quite a lot of people were not literate, or the records that they might have written down were just not deemed that important. People didn't keep their letters, or they didn't have a way to record daily conversations or experiences to the extent that we have today. So we might look at in other places. We might look at laws, for instance. We might look at runaway advertisements for slaves in the newspaper that might tell us something about the experiences of enslaved people. Why were they running away? Where were they going? Okay. We might also look, for instance, at art, okay? Advertisements, broadsides. We might think about, hopefully your gears are turning, you're thinking even about other places where we can find some of the stuff of the past, like material culture, which we're going to look at in chapter 2 and 3, the objects of everyday life. So primary sources, right, they give us a messy, complicated, incomplete, layered, fascinating view into the past, especially into the times and the places that are pretty distant, right, from our current experience today. So now secondary sources. So secondary sources are often based on primary sources. See how those connect together? Okay. So secondary sources are analysis of the past. So that's where, right, secondary sources might gather, read, review, analyze primary sources, and then offer a thesis, an argument that interprets that period of the past, that answers some difficult question that usually starts with how or why, okay? So secondary sources, you already have one right in front of you, and that's your textbook, Give Me Liberty. That's a secondary source. As you can see in each paragraph of the text itself, the ways in which Eric Foner builds analysis, right? Usually in these kind of sandwich formats with sort of an overarching sentence about what's interesting and notable about what's going on. Then in the meat of the sandwich, he'll usually have quotes or primary sources that illuminate and demonstrate what he's talking about, and then he'll usually conclude with kind of a takeaway. So that's really a methodology that you should be using in your discussion board posts and in your essay that you'll write in the final exam. So that's a secondary source, an example, okay? More secondary sources are the articles that you found in JSTOR, okay? So secondary sources can come in book format, they can come in article format. That's kind of the most common ways in which we're going to see them in our course. So that brings us to historiography. So historiography is really the collection of all of these secondary sources. So historiography means writing about history, okay? So just like biography, writing about a person's life, historiography. And historiography is the third major building block of history. So as hopefully you saw in this exercise, historiography is about argument and interpretation. And that's what the study of history is all about. It's not about just kind of identifying interesting things from the past. That's antiquarianism. And it's also not about reaching some objective truth that then we will all be done and we can go home. That's not how the field works either. And if someone's kind of trying to present that version of history to you, then they're not actually doing the work of history. Okay? They're doing something else, probably maybe closer to propaganda. So in that way, what we see is that historiography, the argument about the past, is present, right, all around us. And that's what JSTOR helps us to see. So just by digging in with that one question, you got to see, what are some of the different arguments? How do they relate to one another? How are historians and other scholars in related fields in dialogue about the people, places, events, issues, and questions that we have today about the past? Okay. So finally, I just wanted to make some observations on the first discussion board that I think will help and you as you move throughout the course. So I really liked reading all of your rationales for like why you chose your term. That was really interesting, gave me some good insight into who you are and what motivates you that I'll incorporate into the class. So I really liked your conversations also with each other. It showed your engagement with the people and the places of the age of exploration, which bodes really well for our class this semester. Awesome. So the analysis of your sources and the relationship to each other, right, was pretty solid. And you all seem to have a good grasp that these are things in dialogue with one another again, okay? Authors, scholars, and dialogue. So this, though, is the area where you can always go more in depth. This is really the core work of history, both taking the time, right, to analyze those primary sources and to create those arguments, and then being in dialogue with others about your interpretation. So I'm not looking for all of you to say, yes, I all came to the same conclusion. That would be really boring, and that also would undermine the field of history that we're learning about and practicing this semester. Instead, right, we're always offering our own interpretations and our own arguments that are based solidly in the primary sources and sometimes in the secondary sources and the works that other people have said. We're citing, right? That's the nature of history, okay? And that's what you're going to be doing each week in a discussion board. So the sources and the citation are essential, because if you're just saying things without proper source and proper citation and proper methodology, you're not very reliable as a source, right? So that's why it's really important that you cite correctly, not just to fulfill an obligation, but because it makes you a stronger and more persuasive, right, voice in which to enter into this important dialogue about, in this case, the past, but also as you move out of this class, whenever you're trying to speak with authority and encourage people, right, to take you seriously. So that's important as well. So sources are part of that foundation, okay, and correct citation, and using sources accurately and reliably and not spinning them or twisting them to serve your own purpose, okay? So letting the past speak for itself. So I just wanted to make those comments and just say, finally, I want you to pay close attention to the field of the journal that you are looking at when you're using JSTOR. So some of you were pulling some because of, we're talking about the 1500s, and in this case, some of you were pulling from some allied fields that got into more archaeology, Latin American studies. I saw some of those emerge. So you're going to want to use the limiters on JSTOR. When in doubt, check history. Then you know you're working on journals that are in dialogue with historians and also with the methodology of history. So with that final note, I want you to go back and maybe see if you can find, if it was your post or someone else's post, where other journals outside of the field of history were incorporated. And I want you to think about what are some of the differences that you see in terms of the titles, in terms of some of the summaries, what are these articles interested in? They may be a bit different from what historians are interested in. And finally, you can always go back to Give Me Liberty, and the focus questions in Give Me Liberty are some of the types of questions that historians think about, as well as ways to help you wrap your head around the complicated, difficult, and really fascinating, interesting questions that historians ask and that we'll be asking and discussing this semester.